If you want to condense the spacing of product items on your client site, a quick way to build a more seamless flow is to display a masonry layout like this one. But since Squarespace doesn't have that option at the moment, that's exactly what we'll be tackling today with code. However, before we get started, I want to be clear that we're not implementing real masonry like the one used in other areas of Squarespace. Real masonry with pure CSS is at an experimental point in browsers right now, so it's not quite usable on real-life projects. And real masonry with JavaScript requires a third-party plugin to build the layout. What I'll be doing in this tutorial is showing you how to use a simpler and quicker CSS version that looks like a masonry layout but doesn't behave like one. All this to say, you are going to encounter limitations with this method. However, I still encourage you to give it a shot and see how it works for your project. You never know. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it. I'll be working with 7.1 for this and with my product page set to the grid layout. So that one is this one here. Inside the design tab, I have product layout set to the grid option. I'm also starting out from the final result of the multiple aspect ratio tutorial. I'm going to leave the link in the description box in case you want to check it out later, but it's not necessary to implement this customization. To achieve the fake masonry, we'll be using a property called column count. This is basically going to create a newspaper-like column that flow vertically instead of horizontally. And in order to apply it, the first thing we need to do is look at what is creating the existing grid layout so that we can disable it or override it. So if we inspect this area here, where all of our product items are sitting in, we'll see that there is this container called product list layout container. If I open this one up, I can see that here I have all of the different product list items that I have on this page. And taking a closer look at this element, I can clearly see, at least from the selection that I have on the screen, that this is creating the grid somehow. So now if I look here through the right side, I'm gonna see that there is the display property set to the grid value. And then if I disable this one here and then disable it down here again, I basically get rid of the grid completely and now all of the elements are stacked. So that's pretty straightforward. This container is the one that's creating the grid. So this is the one that we need to modify. Now, in order to use the column count property that is going to turn this layout into one that's more newspaper-like, I first need to make sure that this display property is set to block instead of grid. So because what I'm trying to do is change or override a value that already exists in Squarespace, the easiest route is to reuse the same selector that Squarespace is using for that specific element to set that value, so we can change it with as little friction as possible. So I'm going to grab the selector here and I'm going to add it inside my custom CSS window. Next, let's go ahead and set the display to block instead of grid. And as we previously saw inside the inspect element tool, removing that grid is simply going to stack one element or one item on top of the other. Next, we can go ahead and bring in our column count property. So here I'm going to type in column count. And as the name of the property states, this is going to allow us to decide how many columns this container should have inside it. So because I was working with a 3-column grid, I think I'm going to maintain that same layout and I'm going to be using here 3. So as you can see, now I have a masonry layout built here. Now you're probably noticing two things at the moment. One is that the order of the items changed. So now they're no longer organized horizontally, but vertically, the same way that newspaper content is arranged. And the other thing you may have noticed is that some of the items are sort of split into two. So for example, this one down here, you can see how it's sort of detached from the title and the pricing that was sitting right underneath it. Luckily, to fix this issue, all we have to do is target the items themselves and use a property called break inside. So let's go ahead and see how we can target our items or our separate product list items. So I'm just going to grab the class of product list item, which is going to target all of them, and we're going to set that break inside to a specific value. So here, I'm going to be nesting the code, and I'm going to be adding product list item. So just in case, this way or this setup that I have here in the code is the same thing as having this as a separate snippet. Like that. It's just a slightly faster way to write things down. So I'm going to keep that as it was. And again, we're going to be using here break inside, and we're going to be setting this to avoid because we want to avoid breaking up the different parts of this container. So I'm going to set this to avoid, and now you can see how each of the images is completely attached to their content area. Okay, perfect. So we're almost there. The next thing we're going to do is address the gaps. So you can see here that there is some distance between the different columns, but not quite between the rows. This is happening because both display grid and column count rely on a property called column gap to create some separation between the columns. And because this layout was using display grid before, the little option that we have in here inside the design tab to set the column spacing is adding that column gap to the grid layout, and now it's adding it to our fake masonry layout. So if I were to modify this here, you're going to see how the spacing in between my fake masonry layout are going to get modified as well. So this is perfect because it's one less thing that we need to address via code. However, the rows work differently. With display grid, we do have rows created, but with this fake masonry, we don't. So regardless of whether I set this to a really high number or something really small, nothing is really going to adjust itself in terms of that top and bottom distance. What is going to work is adding a little bit of margin to the bottom of the items. So here we already have the items targeted because we set the break inside to avoid, and now we're going to be adding a little bit of margin at the bottom based on how much we want to separate things. So I think I'm going to be using here something like 30 pixels. That seems about right. All right, so this is looking awesome, but before we jump onto the live side, let's go ahead and address mobile right away. So here, what we would need to do is basically decide at which point we want to change the number of columns that we're creating through the column count property. In my case, I think I'm going to use 2 breakpoints. I'm going to create 2 media queries so that I can set a different number for tablets and yet a different one for mobile. I'm going to go ahead and set that up in here. Media screen and max width 960 pixels. So I'm going to be using this breakpoint for tablet, but you can go ahead and adjust that based on what works best for your design. I'm just going to be using this sort of classic one for tablets. And now I'm going to grab the same selector as before, and I'm going to set the column count to 2. Awesome. So you can see how this is affecting everything from 960 pixels all the way down to smaller phones like this one. So that's why we're seeing 2 columns created here. And now I'm going to replicate this, but I'm going to alter the max width and set it to 640 pixels so that I can keep the column count as 1. So now if I save this and open this up, I can see that by shrinking this down, I get 3 columns on desktop, and then I get 2 columns for tablets, and then I get 1 column for mobile. Perfect. So let's go ahead and take a look at the live side just to make sure that everything is working, because sometimes you never know. So let's reload this. And of course, it's not working. I love it when that happens. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what is going on. So here, we're going to be inspecting the same grid we've been modifying so far. So right now, what I can see immediately is that this is still showing up the previous grid or the native grid that Squarespace was creating. So for some reason, our code is currently not disabling this grid layout. So let's take a look on the right side and see what is going on. So this is the snippet that we created inside the custom CSS window, and this is the snippet that is coming from Squarespace originally. As you can see, the display block here is being crossed off and the display grid is still applying. So that's why our fake masonry is not working. Now, I already addressed a similar issue in the previous video regarding the multiple aspect ratios for the product images, but basically what is happening here is that the CSS file where Squarespace has this code is simply loading after hours. And because our selectors are exactly the same, by order priority, this code is applying and overriding our block value. To fix this problem in this case and any other scenario where this happens, we basically have two options. One is to modify the selector itself by adding more classes or even an ID to it just to make it more robust, more specific than the one that Squarespace is using, or simply forcing our value by using important. In the previous video, I used important to solve the problem, and in this one, I'm going to do it as well just for the sake of time. So let's go back into our custom CSS window. We're going to find that display block, and we're going to set up the important rule. And with that in place, let's go ahead and hop onto the live site again, refresh, and now we can see that everything is working correctly. Then if I shrink this down, I still get to have my two columns at 960, and then I have my single column on mobile. Now, as I mentioned before, the basic or the main limitation of this approach is that we're not going to have control over the order of the elements. They're always going to flow in a vertical fashion like a newspaper column. But if maintaining the order of the products is super important for your project, then you may want to try out the plugin route. If you want a tutorial on that, let me know in the comments below. But for now, this is everything that I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.